back in 8 years. So
I don't know why I'm sure it'll say on here somewhere why they're still collecting money. I'm guessing it goes, this sweepstakes is not affiliated with the 58th Presidential Inaugural Committee. But it does go to Donald J. Trump for President, Inc. Maybe since he can't make any money off his regular businesses, right. I'm just teasing.
He was
it was a joke.
So I didn't think this through. I'm not going to be taking a salary. I'm not going to... $3 from a couple of people, that'll help.
Yeah, that's it. All right, my guest right now is Dr. Ann Pierce, who is a foreign policy analyst. Dr. Pierce, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I read with some interest when I saw last week sort of one of those 5 o'clock drops by the White House that the president had suddenly changed our immigration and naturalization effort for people coming here from Cuba. Maybe I'd be better for me to let you explain what that change was last week.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would put it in the context of this general tendency on the part of Obama and his secretaries of state, Clinton and Kerry, of treating Democratic allies and pro-democracy groups ungenerously while treating adversaries and anti-democratic forces generously. So here we go again with yet another dictator pretty much getting a lot of what he wants from President Obama and the Obama team. What Obama did was he changed this policy, which is confusingly called the wet foot, dry foot policy.
Right.
This allowed Cuban migrants to become legal permanent U.S. residents after 1 year. During the Clinton years, the Bill Clinton years, that policy was changed, made a little more restrictive because no longer were migrants allowed to arrive by boat. They had to arrive by air or by land, which meant that they would take a much more treacherous journey up through Mexico and this sort of thing. So what President Obama did, which it's important to note, was at the Castro regime's request, was he eliminated that special policy for Cubans altogether. So migrants from Cuba fleeing that repressive government no longer have a special place in the United States.
They are, in other words, he changed the policy to fit his new attitude or approach, his embrace of communist Cuba, human rights violator extraordinaire, that suddenly you would have no, why would you have any reason to flee Cuba, I guess is effectively what he's saying, right?
Yeah. And this is part of a pattern of giving dictators what they want and making deals with dictators, which also often around the world are at the expense of the people themselves. The people have very little consideration in Obama's foreign policy. So another group that has very little consideration in his foreign policy is Congress. Congress is constantly stigmatized in our media, but, I get into D.C., I go to hearings a lot. Congress has actually tried very hard to push back about detrimental policies like the Iran deal, like our overly accommodating policies toward North Korea. They've tried to get this administration to embrace more positive humanitarian and strategic proposals towards Syria against that brutal, horrific Assad regime. And Cuba is another case in point where starting in 2009, President Obama and his team started to issue these executive orders, loosening restrictions on travel to Cuba. That then became, in 2014, the normalization of relations with Cuba. This is in spite of the fact that the Castro regime has destroyed the Cuban economy, pilfered resources, and represses the people. And unless the government itself changes, that this policy is sure to benefit the elites. This opening up of commerce and this sort of thing is sure to benefit the elites in Cuba, but not emphasize the people who are most struggling. A perfect example of that is Obama says now Cubans can't come here without a visa. Well, we know who will have the visas. It will be the Castro regime elites. So now, instead of these freedom-loving Cubans coming here, we're going to have the communist or communist-oriented Cubans.
Right.
It's quite something.
Dr. Ann Pierce is our guest. She's got a book out called A Perilous Path, The Misguided Foreign Policy of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. I guess my question for you, Dr. Pierce, is I know Donald Trump is going to have a lot of things to work on when he gets sworn into office on Friday. It strikes me that this is one of those landmines that Barack Obama has laid for him that is not going to be as easy to reverse as the swipe of a pen, because you've now got American investment and flights landing in and out of Havana. This is going to be a bigger policy issue that Donald Trump's got to try to turn around if he chooses to.
Yes, and I'm no Cuba expert, but my hope would be that perhaps he could change the policy without reversing it altogether. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because a couple columnists have suggested that one of the reasons Obama did this at the last hour was to put Trump in a very awkward position. For example, now the hope is, these columnists suggest, that it will be awkward for Trump to take such a strong stand against illegal immigration from Mexico because people will be able to say, well, what about Latinos from Cuba? Why would you be more generous toward them? Of course, the fact that if they're sent back, they're going to possibly end up in prison and even tortured, that has to play into that argument. So it's an interesting ploy, and it was done in a very cruel manner also. I'm not saying that particular wet foot, dry foot policy had never been abused by Cubans. There were some Cubans that came back and forth and used it for commercial reasons and not for political asylum. But wouldn't it have been the right thing to do then for Obama to suggest reform of the law rather than suddenly putting a stop without warning the Cuban people themselves? It was just so cruel to read about that these people who had escaped up through Central America suddenly got there and were told two more people were allowed in, and then the door was closed. And like I said, you have no idea what fate